You all who have joined us. We've joined us in this series on the electoral process in Zimbabwe. I'd like to welcome, in the first instance, old friends, Anne Torstensen from Norway, my old man, my brother, Hasso Patel, Yui Kinat, my brother in Malawi, and many others, but especially our panelists today, Tawanda Chimini, Zimbabwean, who has been a major factor in the Electoral Resource Center in Zimbabwe until his recent relocation to East Africa. Barbara from ERC, Ellen from Zesen, and last but not least, Kennedy Nyaundi from Kenya. Welcome, Karibu. Kennedy, Karibu to this program. Today we're looking at the role of observers, and we have as moderator a very able colleague and partner in crime in this series, Tony Rila from RAW, Research Advocacy Unit. We've been partnering between Sapes Trust and RAW. And today, Tony takes charge of this important, but also very controversial subject, the role of observers. I didn't say nothing which may preempt the discussion. And I hope to express my views in due course, but for the time being is to invite my colleague, Tony Rila, to take over. Tony.
Thank you very much, Ivo. Can everybody hear me quite clearly? Good evening, everybody, and thank you very much for everybody being here. As those who've been watching this series over the last 6 or 7 months, you will know that we've been organizing this webinar series around 5 pillars as a method for looking at the elections. Pillars about information, how information is shared, how the press and media work, inclusion, about how easy it is for people to register and vote, insulation, how much are people protected in participating in elections, and raising the very difficult questions in Zimbabwe about political violence, integrity, and this speaks very much to the whole process of the election process and the role of the election commission, and finally irreversibility, which is the role of the judicial system in dealing with disputes and, in the final analysis, electoral petitions if they happen. And those who've been watching will realize that we've carved these up mainly because of convenience. It's a convenient way to look at elections, but we point out that they're not independent of each other, and there's massive overlap between each and every one of these pillars. Now, where they come together, obviously, is in some kind of assessment of an election. And that's the critical role that election observation takes, is about. And that's the point today, which what is the role of international observers in the forthcoming elections in Zimbabwe? So that looks to the future, but in this discussion, we're also going to be looking at the past. Now, the point about election observation, and as we tried to point out in the series is about an audit of the election. And international observers come as a very important part of the final audit of an election. Did it meet the international standards, etc.? So today we have this very eminent panel, as Ivo has described, and I will introduce them individually as each of them speak. The process is that we will allow each of these people to speak. I will raise any points of content that need to be clarified, and then we will put some very general, but what we think are very important points, and then we will finally go to the floor. So the point about this evening is why our concern with international observation? Well, it's clear that certainly since 1990, elections have become the sine qua non for democracy. The so-called two-change model in the early 1990s, many of the people interested in democracy said you're a consolidated democracy when you've had two elections in which the governments changed. That was the, if you want, the gold standard of democracy. But it's also very clear since that time that elections have also become the basis for a minimalist adherence to democracy. And as we've seen, many commentators talking about, they talk about the rollback on democracy. And in that, they begin to talk about the way in which elections have become less than the standard that they set in the early 1990s. Essentially, a kind of comment could be made, well, they had an election, lots of people voted, and there was a clear winner, so clearly it's a good election. And in that, of course, in Africa, for obvious reasons, the presidency becomes the most disputed. And many countries have an independent poll for the presidency. The presidency wields enormous executive power, and therefore there's sometimes an undue focus on the presidential elections. But like all public processes, elections need to be audited, and the audit for elections frequently provides the basis for legitimacy, in inverted commas. Did the election process meet acceptable standards? Was the playing field level for all players? Was the implementing body non-partisan, transparent? These are the kinds of questions that get raised in the audit and have been raised in the previous seminars. So in order to bolster claims of legitimacy, it's become common that countries invite outsiders to scrutinize the elections, evaluate these, and make a judgment. And that's a very important judgment. And why that's an important judgment is because very often observer groups vary dramatically in the size. If you looked at the 2002 election in Zimbabwe, there was something like 23 different observer groups. Now, some of those observer groups, like the EU, for example, or the SADC Parliamentary Forum, or SADC itself, were very large groups. Others were tiny, tiny groups. So in looking at the election observers, what value do you give to the size and scale, the methodology, the ability to scrutinize over the long process of election as opposed to just the polling day? So these are very, very important judgments, and they frequently become the basis for legitimacy. And my colleagues are going to talk very much about how that process has operated in Zimbabwe, particularly since 2000. But also, international observers frequently make recommendations about what was good and what needs to be improved. And those are in the way of setting new gold standards for a country, and therefore needs to be looked at in the interregnum between one election and another, is the extent to which those recommendations have been taken on board, have they been implemented in an effective way. So therefore, this kind of an audit, and the audit is, as I'm suggesting, is twofold. It's domestic and it's international. This kind of audit can have very, very serious consequences for a country. Now, Zimbabwe has learned that to its cost. 2000, there were very serious comments made about the electoral process by the Commonwealth Observer Mission. Similarly, in 2002, similar recommendations, observations were made. And what was important between the one and the other was in the 2002, 2000 election, I apologize, the Commonwealth said there are certain standards that you must meet, and if you don't meet them in the next election, then this will have serious consequences. And those serious consequences were that Zimbabwe was suspended from the Commonwealth and ultimately left the Commonwealth. Similarly, the EU had some very serious objections in 2002, and that had enormous consequences. So where international observation becomes important, it becomes part of the test of the legitimacy of an election. To what extent can the government go forward with the credibility that the international community requires? So the importance that we talk about here is in international observation, how and what to observe. So in a sense, observation is an empirical exercise. It leads to empirical issues like reliability and validity of the data. There are standards for any auditing process. And hopefully Tawanda Chimini will talk about the empirical basis for international observation, which is essentially the theory behind the observation. Then Kennedy Nyaonde will get practical and talk about the actual experience with international observation, using both his vast experience in participating in such missions, but also from his experience of how observation has worked in Kenya. Barbara Bebe from the ERC will take us a step further and look closely at Zimbabwe and the recommendations made by election observer missions and the extent to which these have been taken seriously ahead of 2023. And then finally Ellen Dingani from the Zimbabwe Election Support Network will look at the critical relationship between international and domestic observers and the complicated interactions between these two groups. It is complicated because these are all supposed to be independent observations, and to what extent is there independence for both, and what is also the need to share information. So with those general comments, I'd like to now move to our keynote speaker, Tawanda Chimini, formerly director of the Institute for, the Electoral Resource Center, and now an independent election observer with an enormous amount of experience domestically in heading campaigns, in being involved in the whole process of domestic observation, the push for reforms within Zimbabwe, and has also been an observer right across Africa. So without further ado, Tawanda, I'd like to hand over to you. Tawanda?
Yes, thank you so much, Tony. It's a pleasure to be invited to this platform to share a bit about my thoughts regarding international election observation and what the experience has been. I hope you can hear me, Tony.
Hear you loud and clear. Thanks, Tawanda.
Okay, that's fine. So I think the major question that often arises, and Tony, you literally took a chunk of what I had hoped to share. But I think a major starting point in terms of interrogating the role of international observers in elections would be the why question. And Tony, you did begin to touch on a lot of these aspects, but I would want to move away from the global issues that have sort of necessitated this need to have observers being deployed and the acceptance of these observers in different elections that have been held on the African continent. So my basis of looking at election observation actually emanates from the African standards themselves. So a lot of what is done by international observers on the African continent is sufficiently captured both in the SADC principles and guidelines for elections when you look at Southern Africa, but more importantly, in terms of the African Union statutes. So you have an African Charter on Democracy, Elections and Governance, which in its own phrasing, identifies that the whole question of elections, in fact, it premises the whole question of election observations around the element that it should contribute to ensuring that there is the promotion of universal values, principles, and standards around democracy and the respect for human rights. So it locates the whole question of election observation around these issues of human rights, of democracy. But interestingly enough, and this is at the African continental level, it mentions the question of universal values. And I raise this specifically because one of the questions that often arises around election observation is what standards and whose standards are being used to assess these elections? So there's an explicit recognition of universal standards, norms and standards, principles around the question of respect for human rights when you look at elections, which is part of the basis of the deployment of international election observers. But added to this whole appreciation of the need to comply with international standards and norms and values, there's also the question of ensuring that there's the promotion of the supremacy of the constitution in the different countries. So African countries have submitted to being interrogated on the basis of these standards. And I think it's important to always refer back to these standards if we are sincere about being judged as countries on the continent, if we're sincere about being judged on the same basis as other countries. So you can't want to be part of the global community or the African community and not accept to be assessed against the standards that have universally been accepted by the same groups that you claim to be a part of. So you find both the SADC statutes and the African Union statutes, providing basis for international observation. And it is through this basis that we have seen the deployment of international missions. And by international, we're not necessarily even talking about those that come from international observers that come from the continent. So the African missions that have been contributing tremendously to how elections have been conducted. So arising from that, it would be remiss on my part not to indicate that in all these statutes that we do have, there is again an explicit reference to the responsibility of member states, both in SADC and in Africa, to create conditions that are conducive for election observation to happen.
Tawanda, just to interrupt.
And you,
Tawanda, you're breaking
this
up.
is again an important element to consider when you look at internet.
Yeah, you're breaking up.
Apologies.
Yeah, just maybe turn off your video. We can see you, but maybe just yeah, great. Okay. Thank you.
Great. So the point I was making was that in addition to the global standards that are captured in the regional statutes and in the continental statutes, we also see a blatant recognition by regional bodies and African bodies that it is important for state parties to create conducive conditions for election observation to happen. So it's a responsibility on every state party, which state party that signed up to say they will make conditions that are conducive for election observation to take place. And this includes ensuring that there's security, there's free access to stakeholders and free movement, and there's non-interference in the work of international observers when they are deployed for elections. So again, these are very important elements. In addition to that, the SADC principles also then indicate the question of actually providing for early accreditation of the election process, including the observation of the entire election cycle. So not just focusing on the deployment of observers, during the voting process, but to include the pre-election processes, the delimitation process, your voter registration process. So all these elements are elements that are recognized as being important elements that should be accessible to observers, including international observers that are often deployed in any election. Now, in terms of the how part, we've seen a huge evolution in terms of how election observation has panned out in Africa. So a lot of people will probably identify election observation, particularly international election observation, with people getting into hotels, coming into a country, getting into hotels on the eve of the election, releasing statements, and talking about what they've seen around the voting process. And a lot of people will then, the anticipation has always been to listen to some of the statements to hear whether they would declare that were these elections free and fair. I think this is a very simplistic way of looking what international observation is all about. So the much broader context around international election observation actually recognizes the need for technical input. So now we've seen election observation missions that will conduct what I could call pre-election assessments. So these will happen way in advance of the elections. There's deployment of experts who come into countries who will do technical assessments of key electoral processes. And a lot of these pre-election assessments are actually undertaken to determine whether it makes sense to deploy a mission or not. And I'm aware that it's where some of these assessments have happened, a decision has been made not to deploy missions at all, based on the technical assessment of the conditions for elections in these particular countries. But apart from having these pre-election assessments, we've also seen election observer missions conduct what they call follow-up missions. So follow-up missions often are the ones that will happen after an election has occurred. So they will happen periodically in between two elections, where these missions will take it upon themselves to look at the recommendations that they have made. They will get into the countries where they were allowed to observe the elections. They will engage with stakeholders to assess if progress is being made around the recommendations that were made. And on the basis of such progress, reports are also released. So that's another aspect that is undertaken with respect to how international observation is currently being undertaken. But in addition, there's also the aspect of deployment of long-term observers. So this is where international missions will deploy maybe 2 months ahead of the elections, technical experts who get in country and begin to assess the election process, and they produce reports, which reports are then used for purposes of informing missions about progress in terms of preparations for the elections, but also informing the observers that are deployed close to the elections, your short-term observers that come around the election process. Then, of course, there's the deployment of these short-term observers. And it's important to highlight that such deployment of short-term observers also comes with a briefing of these observers. So it's not true that some of these observers just come in and they observe and they talk about what they've seen. What actually happens is these observers undergo at times 3 to 5 day training sessions, but also orientation sessions where they talk to long-term observers that have been on the ground, where they talk to election experts, when they interact with election stakeholders to get a firm grip on the contextual elements of the elections that they will be deployed to observe. Around the entire missions, when you see missions that have been deployed, in the background is often the presence of technical experts. So these are people that are grounded in specific areas of assessment of the election process. And Tony, you did talk about some of these specific areas of assessment. These look at the legal framework, they look at the politics, they look at gender elements, some will look at the media. So there are technical experts behind the scenes that are constantly digesting information, are constantly engaging with stakeholders and picking up information to ensure that whatever decisions are taken by these nations, there are decisions that are backed by facts. And Tony, you did indicate that a lot of what international observation is about is the question of empirical evidence. So it's not just about saying what you think happened or what you feel should have happened, but it's about saying what you have found based on the evidence that is at hand. So these are some of the how issues that international observer missions have to grapple with when they're looking at deploying missions. When it comes to reporting, international observer missions have tended to have a 4-point approach to how they communicate what they are seeing. So the major reporting that you get from international observers relate to an arrival statement as the first one, where they will indicate to election stakeholders that they have been invited and they have arrived in country formally, and they talk about who their heads of missions are, they talk about what their mandate is, and they talk about how they work in that country. So these are usually very basic statements that they do release to announce their arrival. Then we've got pre-election statements. So these normally come before the elections, when they talk about what they have seen, what they've assessed. They talk about their expectations, and they usually issue out encouragements to different election stakeholders in terms of some of the things that they feel they need to look at. After the elections, immediately after the elections, international observers tend to release what they call preliminary statements. Now, these statements, if you've been following elections all over, usually outline one very important element, which is to indicate that in as much as they are issuing out preliminary findings, they will acknowledge that the electoral process is still ongoing and that they will continue to watch the process. So you will find that preliminary statements are issued, but these will definitely conduct some preliminary findings about the electoral process. Then after a couple of months, these missions then release final reports. Now, the final reports contain comprehensive information about the entire electoral process, capturing what has happened before, what happened during, and what happened after. So this is basically the framework through which international observation has evolved on the continent, and we've seen it contribute immensely to deterring some of the electoral malpractices that we have often seen. We've seen international election observation contribute to building public confidence in the electoral process. We've seen international observation contributing to voices, amplifying citizen voices about impressions that may be there regarding the election process. So this is basically where international election observation is currently located, and we've seen it being very effective in contributing to improve the integrity of elections on the continent. I know that at times people would want to see more that would be coming out of international observation, but I am convinced, looking at how it has evolved over the years, that it is indeed contributing immensely to some of the changes, progressive changes that we've seen in electoral processes on the continent, where recommendations have been taken on board by some countries. But of course, the experience will differ from one country to the next. And the expectation going forward is that international observation continues to be accommodated. It continues to have a space in our election processes. It continues to contribute towards improvements in terms of the integrity of the election process. Tony, I'll stop here and allow any further questions to be here.
Thank you, Tawanda. I mean, that was very, very helpful. I think you ran through the entire process of what is expected, from the notion that African standards are supposed to be linked to universal standards, that the import of these standards is that states must create conducive conditions for observation, which I presume means both domestic and international. That the observation is of the entire cycle. It's not an event, it's observation of a process. And you link that to the notion that this observation should be empirical, not anecdotal, needs to have data. You talked about pre-election assessments. You talked about ongoing assessments, the role of long-term observers, and the way long-term observers facilitate the quality of short-term observers. So this is not people just parachuting in theoretically for a 6-day jaunt in some exotic country. Actually, it's a very serious business. And when you talked about the reporting process, how important it was, about how the broad brushstrokes are generally covered in some preliminary statement after the elections. And then you talked about the empirical report that happens at the end. So I think you've laid out the framework, I think, for probably both international and domestic observation. So thank you. We're going to come back to you in a little while. I'd now like to move to Kennedy Nyaunde. It's difficult to introduce Kennedy because his CV is exemplary. I mean, apart from the fact that we've invited him here as an election expert who has observed multiple elections all over the place, he also is a very substantial person within Kenya, an advocate, leading member of the legal commission of the legal community. He served in multiple very important commissions and bodies within Kenya, and has a wealth of experience that he brings to this discussion, both as the person who understands governance from within Kenya and the person who has participated in observing with his Kenyan experience the elections right across Africa. So it's also very important because part of, as I said at the beginning, is we have been very interested in this webinar series in the comparison between Kenya and Zimbabwe and the ways in which the two countries have marched on from very, very poor elections to very different positions. So Kennedy, may I welcome you to the floor, and the floor is yours.
Thanks, Tony, and thanks, colleagues and listeners to this evening program. Tony, having given me a topic to work on and listening to Tawanda, he appears to have run through the whole scheme, but I'll squeeze myself in between the bits of information that he has left for us, and perhaps create a discussion point for us later to come to a common understanding of what international observers do. One of the perhaps reasons I would think perhaps I have something to say on this is because I have served as a commissioner with the electoral body in Kenya, I think 10, 12 years ago. And that was really my introduction to this whole aspect of election observation. Now, listening to Tawanda, one would want to ask the preliminary question: why do we hold elections? We all know that elections are really central to democracy, providing an orderly mechanism for political succession by way of conferring legitimacy to those who govern. Elections. That is why, in fact, even dictatorial regimes desire to have an election, because it gives them a stamp of validity, legality, acceptability, everything positive you can think about. And in such an election, again, if you, I don't have a lot of time, so I'll jump back and forth. You remember that the Nigerian military regime in 1992 actually organized their own election observation team because they wanted one person to speak in their favor and to say the election was those three magic words: free and fair. But what do election observers ideally do? They run through a whole spectrum of activities, from pre-election through election to post-election, and then pronounce themselves as to the validity of the election. To be able to do this, it is important for us, again, now I'm going to go to the practical, away from my brother Tawanda's observations. On the practical basis, we want to ask ourselves whether our electoral law makes provision for observers, and we agree that it does. Now, beyond the election law making the provision, there then is the practical issue as to whether election observers are allowed into the polling stations and whether they have got access to the documentation for election protocols. Are they given accreditation to free wheel around the election polling stations? Now moving from the electoral management body to the observer team, to the mission as we normally call them, are they sufficiently trained? Do they possess the expertise to render a verdict on an election? I mean, I heard Ibo Mandaza say, and I want to repeat it for you, my brother Ibo, that sometimes election observers are like election tourists. They jet in a day before the election. On the day of the election, they're packing their bags because they're leaving on the night of the election. And they're quick to make a pronunciation as to whether the election was free and fair. But you see, that is really not possible because the nuts and bolts of election observation would require you to review the legal framework. You probably want, as a long-term election observer, to monitor the registration of voters and candidates, evaluate the work of the EMB, assess political campaigns, when a lot of harm to the democratic process does occur. And I'm talking about Kenya, for example, an election has now become nothing short of an auction. Our politicians walk around with bundles of money. They put young people, ladies and gentlemen into groups and dish out money in full view of everybody. And we say that that is a free and fair election. So the election observer who comes in a few days before the election does not have the advantage of following, for example, the skewed media coverage, often in favor of a candidate supported by the governing party at any one time. So I think election observation has to be seen in the full spectrum, right from the beginning, as I've already mentioned, of registration of voters to the announcement and declaration of the winner, whether presidential, parliamentary, or ward representative, in such a manner as to then speak as to the qualitative and the quantitative aspects of the election. The experience in Kenya, because that is, I think, Tony, you wanted me to shed some light on this. The experience in Kenya is that on election day, the long-term observation team is often supplemented by a large number of short-term observers who visit every polling station, monitor the counting of the ballot and declarations, and they often would stay for about 2-3 days after the election, awaiting the final announcement. It helps that observation missions visit at least, if not a large majority of the polling stations, but at least the critical constituencies where the election is hard fought. And if we are going to take a sample of the polling stations, of course, we all know the larger the sample, the more accurate the results. If you observe only a few hundred polling stations, the pronouncement you are going to make will not give you a good statistical sample. Speaking on the observers, I mean, besides the briefings they get on arrival, it's long been my view that election observation should actually be a kind of professional attainment where people, before they leave their home countries to go for an observation, have gone some kind of training to gain an understanding as to what they are going to do. There were 2-3 afternoon briefings you receive by the technical people that my brother Chawanda has spoken about. It's not enough. And that is why you get people pronouncing a result on an election that the domestic monitors, for example, don't agree with, because the domestic monitors have been in situ much longer, have had the advantage of listening into the campaigns, and can make probably a more accurate observation. Now, Mr. Chawanda has talked about the international standards, domestic standards. That is very good. But if we remember, and this is on Zimbabwe, the 1980 Zimbabwe elections, contrast that with the Namibia election of 1989, and also the South African election of 1984. Those 3 elections may actually be termed as post-conflict elections. And the participation of observers in any post-conflict situation is critical because they are able to pronounce themselves on the confidence deficit in the political process, especially when you're looking at the electoral management body, and therefore you may assure the electorate and the international community on the fairness of the election result. I've spoken about observers providing a seal of approval, legitimacy, and acceptability, and that is both in Zimbabwe and in Kenya. Now, we have seen, and if I take you back to Kenya of 1992, and this is the time that multi-party democracy was reintroduced into the country by the late President Moi. The election we had that year was a very difficult election because the president then did not wish to admit election observers into the country, terming them as foreigners who are coming to interfere with the electoral process, and generally rubbishing the participation of observers in the election. Eventually, you recall that President Moi won by a very thin majority of 38% of the election because the opposition was split, and he happened to proceed on. However, in that period, he had gone around warning observers that they must respect the sovereignty of the host country. They must remember the country has allowed them to come in, and they must therefore not pronounce them in a manner that would increase the tensions that were really high in the country at that time. And this is something one would wish to tell election observers, especially the international ones when they get into the domestic arena, that we must be sensitive to the, say, possibility of violence following our pronouncements. And often election observers look to the quality of the election, but basically looking as to whether any non-compliance with the law has really affected the result. From a legal perspective and from an election worker perspective, this is what we look at as an observer. You look at the quality of the process, then you look at the quantity of any malfeasance you might see and pronounce yourself as to whether that has really affected the result. I remember observing the Zambia election two cycles ago with the Commonwealth, and I was stationed up north in Kisama, if I remember that city. And the election result was made on an evening, and on the morning as we were making our way back to the capital, our vehicles were being stormed. We actually had to get out and remove the Commonwealth banner from our vehicles. Why? Because the community did not accept the pronouncement that had been made by our head of mission that the election was free and fair. So for any observation to be useful, really, we must look at the accuracy of our assessment, be aware that there should be no conflict of interest in the pronouncement. And sometimes, of course, they say, he who pays the piper calls the tune. I think there's something like that. In other words, sometimes international observation missions have got an underlying kind of like weakness to pronounce themselves in a manner that will please whoever is funding the mission. So that then their participation in the election is no longer impartial. It is not objective. It ends up being a cause of problems for the country. Now, I'm coming to an end, Tony.
Thank you.
Often election observers would look to, really the things you see. Is there rigging? Is there fairness in the process? But there's something that is rarely undertaken, but which is crucial to international election observation, and that is mediating cases that might arise either between political parties and the EMB or between political parties themselves. Finally, I want to pronounce myself on what I observe as weaknesses of observer missions. And I've spoken on this in a peremptory manner. Sometimes international observation missions are undertaken as amateurish work, no preparations, no briefings, you get hurried opinions, and that is what we call electoral tourism, jet in and jet out mentality. I have highlighted the fact that too much concentration is given to activities on election day, missing out on the pre-election and post-election periods. And unfortunately, sometimes it is seen that international election observers come into the countries where they are doing observation missions with a patronizing attitude. They ignore or don't even know the culture of the country. I have been in a situation where election observer missions wanted to hold a briefing, conferences with EMB officials who are very busy on election day. But because you have come from the Commonwealth or SADC or AU, you are asking the chairman of the EMB to have a meeting with you at a time he cannot do so, okay? So we also do make, as international observers, very hasty conclusions on matters that we have not really put our fingers to. Finally, Tony, what is a free and fair election? I hold the view that this is not, there is really no fixed universal standard. Unfortunately, many people might disagree with me on electoral competition. The complexity of any electoral process makes the nation of any simple formula unrealistic. There are many things to consider before you can pronounce an election free and fair. It is not the numbers. It is not the first past the post. So you say this guy got 30,000 votes, the other guy got 25,000 votes, therefore the 30,000 votes is the winner. There are many things that we ought to look at before we pronounce ourselves, because there are consequences to our pronouncement. I'll stop there for time's sake, Tony, and maybe make further comments thereon. Thank you very much.
Kennedy, thank you very, very much. That was extremely helpful. I'm going to break what I said before, but you've made one very important point, I think, and that was the training of observers. And your point, I think, was to link the importance of understanding the particular country, that observers cannot come in with merely theoretical standards. They need to understand the country they're going to, the depth and the complexity of the issues involved in that country. That's very important, I think. And you link that also to, I think, a very important point, and that is that in many countries, election observation takes place in a post-conflict situation, and some of those situations that we find ourselves in countries are not necessarily post-conflict, but quite serious internal conflict. I think you alluded to that in Kenya, that there are quite serious internal conflicts going on, as there are in many countries. So I think they were very important points. And I think your final point was the illuminating one, is that election observation is an excessively complicated process. It involves the political, it involves the electoral process, it involves all of those things. So I want to come back to you as others with a couple of other questions. I'd now like to move on to Barbara Bebe from the Election Resource Center. Barbara is the director of the ERC. She's extremely well qualified to understand the nature and the importance of governance. She's worked in citizen engagement, human rights protection, anti-corruption, peace building, electoral processes, social accountability, monitoring. So she comes with a very broad perspective, as well as being deeply involved in the whole election observation process. And hopefully, Barbara, you can lead us through the idea or the problem of the notion of the needed reforms and the extent to which the reforms have been implemented in Zimbabwe, and with particular reference to what has been recommended by international observer groups. Barbara, over to you.
Thank you, Tony. Let me begin by appreciating the invitation to speak at this platform. And it's good to be sharing the panel with Tawanda and other panelists. Thanks to Tawanda and Kennedy for laying the foundation, for talking briefly about international observation broadly, and also for bringing, for the examples that Kennedy provided from different contexts. I'm just going to talk about the recommendations that were proffered by various international observer missions following the 2018 harmonized elections in Zimbabwe. I must say that a lot of recommendations were put forward, and it would be difficult for me to talk about all of them. So what I've done is I've just identified just 5 key areas that I'm going to talk about today. So the first one is on the legal framework. The second one is on election management and administration. The third one will be on the conduct of the state media. I'm also going to talk about the reform of the conduct of traditional leaders and political processes. And then lastly, I'll talk about the reform of the role of the state security in civilian affairs. So the recommendations that I'm going to specifically highlight were provided by the following observer missions, that is IRI and NDI, EU, as well as the African Union. So those are the recommendations that I was able to put together. So the first one on the legal framework concerns the alignment of the Electoral Act to the 2013 Constitution. So part of the issues that were identified by these international observers was on the full independence of ZAC, the need to remove the Minister of Justice and Legal and Parliamentary Affairs from the responsibility of representing ZAC before the Parliament. With regards to this particular recommendation, no changes have been proffered in the electoral amendment bill concerning this. And the minister still represents ZAC before Parliament unless Parliament explicitly summons for ZAC. The second one really was on the alignment of the Electoral Act to the 2013 Constitution concerning the provisions which are related to the constitutional right to vote. That is the inclusion of postal voting for homebound voters and those in hospitals. There has not been progress again with regards to this particular recommendation. Instead, what we have seen is a bit of regression as noted in the High Court judgment on the prison vote that was passed in 2022, which concerned the Yvonne Musarura case, where it was stated that prisoners do not satisfy the residence requirement, thereby cannot be registered to vote. So that is the progress so far. So I can just say there has not been any movement with regards to this particular issue. And then the next one, the second issue concerns the election management and administration, and particularly the misuse of assisted voting. And I think this particular recommendation was tested during the by-elections, whereas ERC, we actually observed the by-elections and were able to test whether or not this recommendation was taken into consideration. But sadly, we noted that there was a worsening of the abuse of assisted voting, of the assisted voting mechanism. In actual fact, for the 2022 by-elections, we noted that certain constituencies and wards had at least, had between 10% and 15% of the total votes cast being cast by assisted voters. And that is quite concerning. And I think if this continues, this could be an issue for the 2023 elections. Still on election management and administration is the issue concerning results management. The observers recommended the publicization of transparent procedures for the tabulation, transmission, and announcement of results. While we've seen a bit of improvement based on the by-elections with regards to the management of results at local level, I would like to note that we are yet to see how this is going to play out at the national level. And also just to state that we currently do not know how ZEC is going to manage the results, because they have not yet come out in the open to say how they're going to manage the results process, especially in light of the disputes that surrounded the management of results in the 2018 elections. The third issue, as I mentioned, is the conduct of the state media. Here, the international observers suggested the elimination of laws such as the Access to Information and Protection of Privacy Act, the Public Order and Security Act, that contravened certain provisions of the 2013 Constitution, guaranteeing freedom of expression, assembly, free media, and access to information. On this particular one, we have seen a bit of movement because we did see the repeal of IPA and the repeal of the Public Order and Security Act, and the introduction of 3 other laws to replace those laws. But however, much as we thought that there had been movement with regards to to freedoms of expression and association. We have noted that since the introduction of the Maintenance of Peace and Order Act, the police in particular have been using this law to actually stifle freedom of assembly. And we've seen a lot of civil society organizations and even political parties having some of the public gatherings, being denied clearance. So I think there is still work that needs to be done there. And then the other recommendation concerning the conduct of the state media related to the Zimbabwe Broadcasting Corporation. It was said that the Zimbabwe Broadcasting Corporation needs to be reformed into a truly independent public service broadcaster, providing equitable treatment to all political parties and candidates. There hasn't really been progress with regards to the conduct of ZBC and other state-controlled media in terms of coverage of different political parties. Instead, we've seen the public broadcaster covering more of one political party at the expense of the other ones. The fourth recommendation concerned the reform of the conduct of traditional leaders in political processes. This one continues to be, there has not been movement in terms of the conduct of traditional leaders. The traditional leaders continue to be partisan. We have noted actually that their behavior has worsened since the last election. The traditional leaders are now being used to openly mobilize citizens to vote for a specific political party. And we've also seen the partisan distribution of food continuing, and also the traditional leaders being given packs as a way of enticing them to campaign for a specific political party. The last one concerns, which is my issue number 5, concerns the reform of the role of the state security in civilian affairs. This concerns, the specific recommendation was that the military's role in civilian affairs should be reaffirmed in accordance with the Constitution, and accountability of all military and security forces could be entrenched through parliamentary oversight. As I mentioned before, we've seen an increased repression by the Zimbabwe Republic Police, clamping down on open participation and campaigns. And as I also stated earlier, the use of MOPA to restrict the openness of the electoral environment. So these are the 5 issues that I thought I had to specifically share with you. And also noting that, as Tawanda did highlight, the role of international observers really is to provide recommendations. And when recommendations are proffered, it is up to the government or the state to take those recommendations and to comply. And I think the question that probably we may need to ask ourselves is, what can be done to get governments to comply with some of these international observers' recommendations? Thank you. I'll end here.
Barbara, thank you. That was a pretty swift, erudite analysis of reforms or lack thereof. It was all on its own, a little audit that I think we need to take careful note of. I think you made the points very clearly that very few recommendations have been taken on in any comprehensive way ahead of these elections. Thank you very much. Finally, not least at all, Ellen Digani from the Zimbabwe Election Support Network, who works as the programs coordinator. And she has been an election specialist for 20 years of experience and worked and observed elections in, by a rough count, about 10 or 11 countries. And obviously is experienced in looking at the comparative differences between Zimbabwe and many of the other African countries. Barbara, it's a very important input that you're going to make, because I think as a domestic observer, you are in this unenviable position of being privy, as Kennedy pointed out, to all the nuanced information about what's going on, the nuanced information that, in fact, international observers need. But obviously, there are complexities that come with being a domestic observer and interacting with international observers. So we'd be very interested in your experience as both local and regional expert in how you find the interactions between domestic and international observers, and with particular reference to Zimbabwe. Ellen, over to you, dear.
Thank you very much, Tony. And I also want to appreciate the opportunity to make this engagement, opportunity from SAPES and RAW. So I'll talk about domestic observation, of course, and also regional and international observation, the differences, and also maybe compare to some of the observations that have come from the previous discussant and also speakers. But most of the things actually have been said, especially by Kenneth, about domestic observation. So I'll try also not to repeat some of those things. So to start, I will say both local and international observation or regional observation, they are guided by a number of either principles, laws, or rules, or code of conduct that guides their observation. And most of the time, most of the international observers or regional that I've interfaced with, they actually seek to complement the domestic observers. I think Tawanda has also spoken about this. They also try to reinforce, to put an emphasis on some things probably that maybe domestic observers may not be able to say. Some can say, maybe saying it like it is. If you recall, in 2002, I think that was the last international observation mission to Zimbabwe of many international observers, the likes of the European Union, the likes of, I think, NDI or IRI, and in the 2018 elections, some of these international observers were invited under the mantra of the Second Republic, or also there was a lot of rhetoric on having free and fair elections, opening up, Zimbabwe opening up for business, opening up for all those kind of things. So these observer missions were invited by the government. Why they were not invited in the past elections since 2002, I think for the obvious reasons, maybe I would say maybe the objectivity that they had on our elections, and how they actually said a spade is a spade in terms of how the elections were being conducted in Zimbabwe. Our elections used to be, or rather maybe they continue to be, because of the absence of reforms, quite a challenge in terms of the absence of electoral reforms, issues of intimidation, issues of violence that we continue to see in our elections. So both local and international observers, they try by all means to be guided, like I said, by principles. They also try to systematically, comprehensively, and accurately gather information. Having been part of quite a number of international and regional observer missions, they try to be thorough. They try to gather as much information and to meet as many stakeholders as they can within a short space of time. While on domestic level, because you stay in that country as domestic observers, you are also working around the electoral cycle. In some instances, in our case as an organization, Zimbabwe Election Support Network, we actually have members throughout the country that continuously gives us information pertaining to the environment in the pre-election, polling period, and post-election. So we have an advantage of being citizens, an advantage of residing in different communities and continuously gathering information. But when the international observers come, they try, of course, they cannot match the locals, but they try as much as they can to gather as much information as they can, meeting local community people, meeting key stakeholders, political parties, meeting religious, traditional leaders, and so forth. So it's a way of trying to gather as much information as they also meet even local domestic observers as international observers. And one thing that I have noted, domestic observers also need to be very strategic in providing information that these international observers can actually try to validate, triangulate, and influence even in terms of what they will report. Because by virtue of being domestic observers, like I said, you have more access to communities, also more access to information. You know the terrain better than the international observers. But at the end of the day, it's all about gathering information that can make a domestic or international or regional election observer mission to make an informed assessment of the election based on some of the principles, some of the laws, some of the international obligations that these states are part to, that the first speaker actually spoke about. The issue of impartiality is emphasized in most of the missions I have been to. It's also emphasized even in our organizations. The moment you become partial and you are trying to assess an election on a biased basis, you cease to be an independent election observer. So emphasis is put on being impartial. Emphasis is put on making sure that your assessment is as objective as possible, and you gather information from all parties, all stakeholders. When you meet the incumbents, you also need to meet the opposition. You also need to meet the local stakeholders, and even try to validate or even try to share information amongst yourselves, even as international observers. So you find that now, these days, many international regional observers, they actually form what they call sometimes coordinating groupings, where they actually share information on what they are observing, what they are gathering, just to triangulate and validate some of their findings before they even write the statements or the reports that Tawanda has rightfully alluded to, the preliminary statement, the report, the pre-election statement, and so forth. They meet and share information at technical level and sometimes even at head of missions level. The other thing that is also that was also noted over the years as an organization, most of the conclusions that are drawn by observer missions about the electoral processes are based on high standards of accuracy in terms of information, impartiality analysis. If you look at our report as an organization of 2018, you look at the African Union report of 2018 in Zimbabwe, the EU election observer report of 2018, and other reports that were, most of the things that we said are almost similar, if I can use that term. Most of the recommendations are almost similar. As an organization, we managed to compile all the recommendations that were made in 2018, and we came up with 223 recommendations from quite a number of election observer missions, EU, NDI, RI, Commonwealth, SADC, MESA. There was also the ESN, ENSA, that's Electoral Support Network of Southern Africa. The locals, it was ZESIN, there was also CCJP and others. there were 223 recommendations. But when we're then now mainstreaming, looking at similar and duplication, we ended up with 115. Of those 115, there are some recommendations that you don't see in the domestic observer reports, but you see in the international election observer reports or regional election observer reports. So this just reinforces the idea that at the end of the day, it's about complementing each other. It's about making sure that there is reinforcement and emphasis on some of the things that domestic observers actually speak about. And if you also look at the proposition of international observers, I agree to a certain extent on issues of training, that sometimes it's not as comprehensive, sometimes it's not as rigorous as it should be. Training that is done by international regional observer missions. It's because of also the timing, the duration, but most of these people, they are working on these things like election matters, maybe on day-to-day basis. Some of the missions that I've been to, you find that they have a core team of experts. I will give an example of African Union, where I've done a lot of observer missions with them, that they actually have a core team, and most of the core teams that they put in place are drawn from civic society. And these are experienced people. These are people that are sometimes known as political, legal analysts, gender experts, media experts in their home countries. And they also undergo a training of managing, coordinating their mission, and even in terms of writing, how the language that particular regional or international observer mission experts in terms of their writing. So they are deployed sometimes as long-term observers, and then sometimes they continue into a short-term observer mission. So in the case of Kenya, the team that was in Kenya was there for about 3 months. 3 months, I think you tend to appreciate the context more than observers that come for just 12 days or 10 days. So not deploying long-term observers, I think there are various reasons that they could actually speak about if they were here as regional or international observers, issues of resources and so forth. But the fact that you interface with different stakeholders, in particular domestic observers, I think it's very important. I think I see Tony, you've put your video on. I think for now, I'll pause here. But I actually wanted to pose a question to our main speaker, Tawanda, maybe just to reflect as an international expert in elections. Maybe to Tawanda, if you can also just help us interrogate whether election observation is actually adding value in repressive environments, whether by domestic or by international observers, especially in a repressive environment. Is it making an impact or a difference, or is just a waste of resources? Thank you, Tony. Over to you.
Thank you, Ellen. You took the words right out of my mouth. That was kind of the question I was going to raise. I mean, I've been very interested in all of you stressing the importance of this empirical process. You've raised how there are standards, how people try to work through those standards, how you do the best that you possibly can, both domestically and internationally. But you've raised the question that in many countries, observation as the test of legitimacy is a serious threat, particularly to repressive governments. And currently in Zimbabwe, we have, for example, the Private Voluntary Organizations Act, which not yet signed, but maybe, and is an act that might well seriously handicap domestic observation, which would, I think, seriously damage the relationship that you've just outlined and Kennedy outlined, and to some extent Tawanda outlined, about the need for the sharing of this information to come to some kind of agreed empirical basis. So maybe I'll take your question and I'm going to put it to, you've raised the question, I'll come back to you and ask you what you think about that. But maybe I'll start with Tawanda and ask you, to what extent do governments interfere with domestic observations such that you break the nexus between international observers and local observers? Because for all the reasons that you've raised, the international observer will not have the deeply nuanced information and understanding of domestic observers. So Tawanda, maybe you could pick that up.
Rather difficult question to respond to. I hope you can hear me, Tony.
Yeah.
Yeah, so we have definitely seen attempts on the continent to limit what observers can do. And this has been seen through passing of legislation specific to election observation, which insists on international observers and domestic observers not issuing out statements before they have been reviewed by the authorities, particularly by the Election Commission. We've seen attempts to say that whatever statements that have to be released, they have to be reviewed and edited at times. We had a particularly interesting experience around that, where it's difficult to engage with local stakeholders, where and not necessarily through legislation, but through the atmosphere that is created around the election. There is a sense that is created where domestic observer groups are actually afraid to meet with international observers. So it's both from a legislative perspective and from an environmental perspective that we've seen this nexus between international observers and domestic observers. But in almost all the cases, we have seen international observers actually pushing back against any attempts to influence or to contaminate their independence. And we have seen this right across. These are international observers coming from outside the continent and international observers, regional observers coming from the continent, where they have pushed back and insisted to authorities that they will act independently and they will push out their statements. And we have seen, particularly the regional groups, actually issuing out strong statements against elections that have not particularly been conducted in good light. And in such instances, and this probably answers Ellen's question, in some instances we have then seen attempts by governments to re-engage with these observer missions to say, how do we address some of these issues? So a lot of then what happens, because remember I indicated right at the opening that a lot of excitement around observers is around what they say at the preliminary statement stage. But there is a lot more that happens through a lot of the engagement that Ellen was talking about, where conversations, very sincere and candid conversations do happen between authorities, particularly election management bodies and government, around what is coming out of their elections. And one interesting element I would encourage people to look at when you look at international observation reports is not necessarily to look at the verdict, but try to look at how the recommendations, the findings and recommendations are actually couched. So there is the question of diplomacy that must be taken into account to ensure that at least there are cordial relations. But if you are really interested to know where the challenges were and what election observer missions are actually saying about an election, it would be important, particularly for the media, to pay particular attention to the findings and recommendations, not just to look at whether they've said, was this election free or fair? So that's how I would engage with the questions that were raised. And I think there's a huge opportunity looking at where Zimbabwe is. There's a huge opportunity, and Ellen, I'm quite excited that you raised this. There's a huge opportunity for stakeholders in Zimbabwe to reconsider their engagement strategy with international observers. You need to understand that there is a high threshold of issues such as evidence. There is a huge responsibility on the part of election stakeholders to ensure that if you are talking about any of the challenges that are emanating out of an election process, you have the responsibility to provide evidence that supports this. The more the evidence, and we've seen this, the more likely that such incidences that are of concern to domestic partners make their way into international election observer mission reports. So it's important to consider that element. The language aspect is also quite important. At times, there are sensitivities around how you present your issues. So at times, I have worked with domestic groups. I've worked on elections in country, in Zimbabwe and other places. At times, we do, as observers, get quite emotional about our issues because we are directly being affected by them. But at times, when we are overly emotional about those same issues, we lose part of the audience that we're trying to engage. So who we may want to understand what our issues are. So there are certain things that domestic groups in the election country need to consider and look at how they can do things differently. Consider what has worked and what has not worked in the past. So that at least this relationship interface, Tony, that you're talking about between domestic groups and international observers can be much more functional. There is a way that this can be done, and looking at where Zimbabwe is, I think this is part of what the investment should be by domestic stakeholders. How do they communicate with international observers? How do they document the challenges that they are facing? Which challenges they want to be taken seriously by observers that are coming in country? How do you ensure that your level of engagement does accommodate conversations, particularly if you consider that a lot of these international observer groups will come with those sensitivities to say, we don't want to be seen to be interfering with what is happening in country, but we do have a responsibility to be objective and to put out what we would have observed. So these would be my responses to some of the questions that had come out.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Tawanda. That's very helpful. Kennedy, maybe I can move to you and reframe the question very slightly. You've been part of the internal and the external. The extent of the interaction between domestic and international observers and the points you were making about the important empirical basis, the qualitative and the quantitative basis that leads to decisions. How critical is that, and how easy is it for governments that are unwilling to have clear scrutiny? How easy is it for them to influence that process?
Thank you, Tony. I think on the first issue, the interaction between the domestic and international observers is really at two levels. Firstly, it is at the interpersonal level, and secondly, at the institutional level. It helps much if the heads of the international missions are known to each other, probably have worked together, and are able to therefore connect as individuals. And this usually would happen at the point of writing the initial preliminary report. Because you can imagine it is completely unacceptable, one would say, if two international missions were to render a verdict on the election that is contrasting to each other. So there is often, I have seen, sort of like discussions, Commonwealth, talking to the EU, talking to the Carter, Foundation Observer Mission. What are your preliminary views on this election? Do you think that the election has been free and fair? At that basis, there's a lot of engagement, so that then the reports you would see speak more or less the same language in principle. What sometimes lacks, and I alluded to this earlier, is an interaction between domestic and international observers. Because unfortunately, you get a feeling that the international observers consider themselves either more qualified or more, should I say, objective in their observations, and therefore there is less engagement between domestic and international, as against when you compare different international missions. An election, the EMB people, is a process. So you would follow through the process and check the qualitative manner in which the voters were registered, the campaigns, the media participation, the training of the electoral workers, the training of political party agents in the polling stations. That is the qualitative. You check how effective positively the processes have been, all electoral processes. Then you ask yourself the secondary question, cumulatively, what is the effect of any failures that you have seen in the process? Is the non-compliance with the constitution of the country, the law, the schedules pertaining to the election, can you say that the quantitative effect of it has resulted in a failure in a free and fair election? And so those are the, it's really a twin question. Is one question looked at from two different perspectives, but that must give you a same answer. And that is how often international observers or even domestic observers and monitors would return their verdict, whether the effect considered in totality has been to void the election. And I would say that, frankly, from my limited participation in observer missions, it is the reality that an observer mission would say this election has not been free and fair. The election must have been conducted in such a bad manner that it does not reflect the will of the people. So free and fair is considered against the will of the people. And even when there has been sporadic cases of violence in certain regions, when it is considered as an overall image, you ask yourself, what is the voice of the people in the nation? What have they said? And often I see international observer missions in their reports to say, although there was sporadic violence, although some polling stations opened late, although the transmission of the results was not as effective, the result reflected the will of the people. So largely, the observer mission will be very reluctant to return a negative verdict.
Thank you, Gary. That was a very interesting point you made there. It has particular relevance in Zimbabwe, and it links to the problem where we get conflicting reports, and particularly reports where I remember the earlier reports between the Commonwealth and the South African government mission, where one group said it was clearly not free and fair, and the other group said it was reflected the will of the people. So I think it goes back to your original point about elections being very, very complex issues. I'm mindful of time now, and I'm wondering whether there are questions coming from the floor. So if you have any question from the floor or comment you want to make, I can see some comments coming in the chat box, but maybe back to just on this general issue we're discussing, which is, I suppose, about the validity of the election audit and the final conclusions. Whether, Barbara, you have any comments on that, or Ellen, you've got any comments on that? Maybe I can go to Barbara first. Do you have any views on that?
Sorry, please come again, Tony.
Barbara, you seem to have disappeared. Hi.
Yes, I asked you to come again. Please ask your question again.
Sorry, I muted myself by mistake.
Yeah.
Sorry, Barbara. The general discussion we've just been having now, which I suppose is the validity of audits about elections, the conclusions that you can draw, or the way in which governments might skew those conclusions by interfering with observation, particularly domestic observation. Do you have any comments on what you've been listening to?
Yeah, maybe just to say, given that international observation largely depends on domestic observation, if the environment is not very conducive for long-term observation to happen, then that could somehow, to an extent, affect the overall international observation process, in the sense that if domestic observers probably have fear, are not freely, cannot freely express themselves, or cannot access certain areas to be able to observe election activities, that can actually compromise their long-term observation reports. And international observers largely depend on some of those reports. But however, at times, even though the environment may be repressive, may be difficult, domestic observers could be able to have some of the things, some of the issues that they may not be comfortable stating in their own reports publicly. They can relate this to international observers who probably have, the freedom to say out some of those recommendations. I guess that explains why you would find that, as Ellen did state, that the international observer reports for the last election did capture some of the recommendations which were not captured in the domestic reports. And I think that explains that perhaps some of the domestic observers did not have the liberty to include some of the issues that the international observers had to capture. So overall, I would say that international observation remains critical. I think that they have a stronger voice. They are more authoritative. Their recommendations, they hold more weight. They are respected. And I think their observation processes also come with very high standards. For the international observation missions that I've participated in, particularly the IRI, NDI observation missions, they really, use quality standards, high standards to do their observation. So I'll end there. Thank you.
Thank you, Barbara. I mean, I'm going to pose a very difficult question to both you and Ellen, because it's topical. We're actually going to an election. We're going to an election in 4 or 5 months' time. And on the table is a piece of legislation that, in the view of many, could dramatically handicap any domestic observation. I raised this point earlier. And so explicitly, I mean, do domestic observers in Zimbabwe, like many of the human rights groups, are you concerned about the PVO bill and the extent to which this might handicap your observation? Because that clearly, in the way that all of you have been talking about, would severely jeopardize the relationship between domestic and international observers. Any view on that, Barbara? And I'd like to put the same question to Ellen.
Okay,
Barbara?
maybe I can come in. Okay.
Yeah, Ellen, go ahead, please.
Please go ahead, Ellen.
Okay. So definitely, Tony, we are equally affected. And I think the last year, around 17 October, the UN actually recognized domestic observers, actually observers in general, whether domestic, regional, international, were actually recognized as human rights defenders. So we are now, as domestic observers, under the class of human rights defenders by virtue of the work that we do. And the PVO bill in Zimbabwe equally affects us, and even the timing, it's also quite worrying whether or not as organizations we are going for registration or we are not going to be registered, we don't know. But if you also look how things have been evolving, already there is subtle implementation of the PVO bill. If you try now to engage in some communities, like some provinces like Marsh Central in Zimbabwe, Marsh East, it's becoming more difficult in terms of you need to have an MOU and so forth. So indirectly, the bill probably, I can say it's already being implemented in some communities. So the implications on us, if we are not registered, it means we're not able to deploy observers, because definitely one of the requirements that ZEC is likely to ask is whether one is registered or not to be accredited to be an observer. But what we have seen also in Zimbabwe is that in every election that I've observed in Zimbabwe, when you go for accreditation, sometimes you also want to know who else is being accredited. I've also seen quite interesting organizations being accredited to be observers in Zimbabwe. At one point, I actually met some observers in a polling station that called them youth in tourism. They were accredited as youth in tourism, as observers. At some point, I also saw drivers and transporters being accredited as observers. So such organizations can actually be formed to counter or to replace some domestic observer groups that are known or that are common in the country. Tony, if you can allow me to also just interact with some of the questions and some of the,
yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah. One thing I've also noted in terms of regional and domestic observers or international observers, let me just call international observers, I will mean all the other ones that are not domestic, is the issue of following up on their recommendations. I think it's one thing that most of the international observer missions are not doing. I know they are the likes of EU, they normally do what they call follow-up. They come back after like 2-3 years, and then they try and see how many recommendations have been implemented. They also try to engage stakeholders. What are the issues? What are the problems? What are the challenges? And even engaging the government, because most of the recommendations in our reports in Zimbabwe, if you look at our election observer mission reports, they are mostly on the government, parliament, and so forth. So those follow-ups are very critical. Those follow-ups are very important. I know also SADC used to do that. African Union need to do also follow-up missions. I think they remain critical. Then there are also what are called, you know, when there are these missions, they also sometimes do what are called preventive diplomacy missions. I've seen this in Zambia. I've seen this also in Kenya, where the head of missions try as much as they can to make sure that if there's a transition, there's smooth transition, smooth handover of power from one president to another president. I think that is a positive in terms of the capacity, what international observers can do, and that cannot be done by domestic observers. I thought that's important to note, especially being done by REX, the likes of SADC, the likes of African Union. I think it's quite something that we need to commend and applaud, because domestic observers may not be able to do that preventive diplomacy. It has worked very well in transitions or tightly contested elections. In the case of Zambia and Kenya, I've actually witnessed that and saw the fruits of preventive diplomacy. I just thought I should just add and also respond to some of the questions. Over.
Thank you, Alan. I think it was a very important last point you made, and it came from the pre-webinar discussion where Ibo was raising the point that late reporting is often a real problem. And that is that if you report late and your conclusions come a very long time, effectively the transfer of power has happened, whether that is legitimate or not, and that creates a problem. And of course, all elections are about transfer of power, and that needs to be done effectively and legitimately. At this particular point, we're kind of running out of time. I was just wondering whether anybody else, just a question. Barbara, did you have any further comment on this? Ellen stepped in. I don't know whether you wanted to say something else on this point.
No, I don't have any further comments.
Okay, thank you. All right.
Just to say, there's a question in the chat about is AU and REX gotten accreditation to observe outside Africa from Vitalis?
Right. Well,
yeah,
yes.
I'm not sure. I'm not sure in terms of the REX, but I know there have been individuals in my country that have been invited to also observe elections in America and in Europe at individual organizational level. But at that level of REX, I'm not sure. But I know individuals have been invited to actually observe elections in America and Europe as well. I myself observed in South America at some time, which is also something that some of these international observer missions actually do. They invite, when they are observing in Europe or in America, they actually invite Africans to be part of their missions, but not as Zesin, but as part of that mission, but being an African. So, which is also something that is positive, that is being done by international observers. Thank you. Over.
Kennedy, I see.
It's also important, Tony.
Yes,
it's important to observe that accreditation is given upon application. So the question is, have these entities applied and been denied? I suspect not.
You suspect that they haven't applied rather than they've applied and denied?
That would have made big news.
No, I think it would be very interesting if AU and SADC had interviewed the last US presidential election. It would have been extremely interesting to see what we might have to say about international standards. I don't see any hands. Has anybody got any comment to make at the end before I go back to the panel for their last comments? Barbara, unfortunately, has to leave, but anybody on the floor there? I see a few names there. I was wondering whether Larry Garber might want to make a comment or two. Larry, any comment on this? No? Okay. All right. Well, then let me just go back to the panel, starting with with Tawanda. Tawanda, any last thoughts about this evening?
Yeah, Tony, my last thought, and maybe it's a bit of a follow-up to Ellen. It's quite interesting that, when you look at a lot of the African observer missions that have been deployed across the continent, there's been heavy participation by Zimbabweans in those missions. And interestingly, you're not only getting Zimbabweans in civil society, you actually get Zimbabweans in other capacities, people from the Election Commission, people from government, who are part of these missions. And they have looked at how these elections are done, and they do contribute to the writing of the reports. So I just wanted to add that and say, look, the way international observation is evolving, it has definitely started to respond to some of its original limitations. And part of how we can enhance the capacity of international observation comes through the type of feedback that RAW are providing, where some of these issues are raised and that are taken evolution around these elements. Ellen did mention the follow-up missions, and there are some African observer missions that are starting to conduct follow-up missions. I know ASA is an example. It's conducting follow-up missions on its recommendations. They've done so in Gambia. They continue to do so in other countries in West Africa. So a lot of these recommendations of such platforms that you're creating, there is an opportunity for a lot of these elements to actually be incorporated to enhance what international observation can provide and can influence going into the future. But thank you so much to RAW and to
Thanks, Tawana. I think you just made an important point there, is that the sharing and the participation of Africans in each other's international missions obviously is raising the quality within countries of domestic observation. I think Ellen made that point, and you are an example of that. So thank you very much. Kennedy, any last thoughts, remarks that you might like to make?
Very brief. I mean, just to recognize that election observation is now the norm, no longer the exception. And maybe speaking to the electoral management bodies, that there's a lot of utility to be served in taking seriously the comments given by election observers, because they then will improve our course of democracy. Because remember that election observation is not an end in itself. It is meant to serve the positive course of democracy, improve our compliance with human rights, and realize the political rights of citizens as spelled out in the ICCPR, regional documents, and in our respective constitutions. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I think that's a very, very wise summary there, that this is not an end. It's a process towards the standards that the region, the continent, the international community sets. So it's a way to move forward towards democracy and the observance of human rights. Thank you very much, Kennedy. Any last thoughts, Ellen?
Yeah, thank you, Tony. Maybe just to say that most observer missions, whether domestic, international, if you look at the reports that are now being produced, it's no longer about the final verdict. It's no longer about freeness or fairness. It's for me, it's more about improving your elections. So some of us, we now look at the recommendations. How many recommendations have been made? But like what my colleagues have said, elections, I think that was Kennedy, are complex, but they have also become very, very expensive, because when some of the stakeholders look at the recommendations, some see business opportunities. That a recommendation about maybe to incorporate ICTs in your elections, a vendor will see that as an opportunity and come and sell a product. You've seen that already. Many countries are now migrating to use of a technology in elections, I think, which is another topic that you may also want to consider as RAW and SAPES, which is quite interesting. Use of technology. Nigeria, for example, the issue of use of beavers in Nigeria. what is the impact, what is the implication? Does it make our elections very expensive and difficult to also observe? So I think that would be my conclusion. I'm concluding, posing another complex issue, unfortunately. But thank you so much for the opportunity. It was an exciting discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you for posing more problems at the end. Thank you very much, Ellen. So winding up, folks, I think what I've concluded from this is that for sure there's a very clear framework for observation, both international and domestic. It's highly elaborate now. The experience over the years has created technical understanding, clear rules for what they do, and these are applied between domestic and international observers. And as Kennedy's just pointed out, this is not any longer an isolated thing. Election observation is now the norm. And I think, as Tawanda pointed out in the beginning, that was a clear understanding by the AU that elections are a way to bolster human rights and democracy. I think another point that came out, and that was very important, was the importance of comprehensive training and awareness of local conditions. Whilst rules may be universal or regional, each country is very different, has different complex problems, and it's key that international observers and domestic observers have common ground in the understanding of what the political conditions are in an election that they're observing. Not one shoe fits all. I think that's very, very important. And that implies what I think most of you have mentioned, is the importance of long-term observation of technical experts who are able to guide the process of the international observers. So they end up on the same page as domestic observers. I think the sad point was that when Barbara outlined how recommendations are taken on, the general point is that international observers make recommendations and they do follow-ups and they have technical people coming. But the fact is that when we look at the period from 2018, the recommendations that have been made both by domestic and international observers, and the concurrence between them, I think the audit suggested that there has been minimal attempt to address those recommendations. I think that's a very serious observation ahead of the elections in 2023. I think the heartening thing was to hear from everybody is how hard domestic and international observers need to work together to work from a mutual framework to ensure that the qualitative and the quantitative information meets. And I think, as Ellen pointed out there, that if you start to look at the reports on Zimbabwe in particular, and it may well be true for many other African countries, the corroboration between domestic and international observers based on empirical data is extremely good. And I think it's for this reason that we went back to the original point and of thinking about what will international observation do in Zimbabwe, and to look at the significant threats that stand in front of us ahead of this election and have been outlined not merely about observation, which after all is the final audit, but the process that we've been observing in the 6 or 7 webinars, in fact, I think it's nearly 9, at looking at the elections. And the clear understanding, I think, that we have is that the conditions are not propitious for 2023 in the conditions that lay on the ground and the kind of audit that we would expect to come when the election is finally takes place, whether July or August or whenever. So on behalf of Rao and of SAPIS, I want to thank each of the speakers, to Barbara, who unfortunately has left us, to Tawanda and to Kennedy. Kennedy, thank you for giving up your time. And to Ellen, and thank you for a very, very interesting and I think fruitful discussion. And I'd like to hand over to Ibo right now. Ibo, over to you.
Thank you, Tony. I don't have much to say except to say the following. One is to reiterate that this is part of an audit process. We are moving closer to the day or the date in April when we will have an international conference to present a summary and an elaboration of this audit of the Zimbabwean electoral process, after which we'll discuss the way forward. Secondly, is just to thank the panelists, Kennedy, Asante Sanubwana, Barbara, Helen, and our homeboy, Dawn Michimini, and above all, our moderator, Tony Rila. Thank you very much indeed, and good night.